Spider-Man Far From Home is just around the corner, and while we're excited to see Tom Holland's Peter Parker face off against some of the hero's less prominent foes, we're talking Hydro Man and Molten Man, we can't help but wonder if in the future what other obscure or smaller villains of the web slingers might make it up onto the big screen. So today, we are jumping into hypothetical land and counting down our picks for the top 10 Spider-Man villains too weak for the MCU. Now most of these villains are utterly ridiculous, with a pretty large percentage of them appearing in Spider-Man's comics after the Secret Wars event, when Parker donned the black symbiote costume briefly, before it was officially a symbiote, which was also a result of fan backlash for the costume change. Anywho, some of these villains actually stand a chance of making it into the MCU if adapted in a creative way, and some do have some pretty nifty abilities, we'll give them that, but most of them will just make you chuckle. So with that in mind, let's get to it. In at number 10, Chitlock. This character is a very strange one that appeared in Sensational Spider-Man Volume 1 Issue 13 in 1997, and technically was more of an opponent of the Hulk's than Spidey's. It is a 25-foot tall half-chicken, half-cow creature that lives in Antarctica, just outside of the Savage Land. It used to be worshipped a millennia ago, but went into hibernation. After a hole in the ozone layer caused the ice around the Savage Land to melt, it woke up and somehow got to Monster Island, where it fought the Hulk. Spider-Man, along with several other heroes on a S.H.I.E.L.D.-sponsored mission, are entangled in all of this after they discovered that Roxxon oil was behind the ice melting faster, and releasing the likes of Chitlock and other creatures, including our next number. In at number 9, Stegron. Compared to that half-chicken, half-cow abomination, Stegron has had more longevity in Marvel Comics, funny enough. He's also known as the Dinosaur Man, a dude named Vincent Stegron who was hired by S.H.I.E.L.D. to study the DNA of dinosaurs from the Savage Land. Inspired by the experiment that turned his colleague Dr. Kirk Connors into the Lizard, Stegron attempted a similar experiment but with some stolen dino DNA, which then turned him into a semi-humanoid Stegosaurus-like creature. He could command dinosaurs, which is actually pretty cool, and tried to overrun NYC with dinosaur buddies from the Savage Land that Spider-Man and friends had to help stop. During the encounter that we mentioned in our previous number, he actually ended up aiding Spider-Man rather than fighting the hero, when he realized that they were trying to save his home of the Savage Land. We're all in this together. And at number 8, Typeface. Typeface, aka Gordon Thomas, first appeared in Peter Parker's Spider-Man Volume 2, Issue 23 in 2000. Thomas fought in the Vietnam War, a war that took the life of his brother Joey. When he returned to the US, he was not the same. His wife left him and took their son with her. Gordon kept on living, becoming a signsmith until he was laid off. That was the straw that broke Gordon's back though. He decided he would become a supervillain, taking on the name Typeface, and using a grease pencil to write letters all over his face, including a big R that stood for retribution. He began committing vandalism, which caught Spider-Man's attention. Typeface would fight off the web slinger with giant letters. He then escaped, went back to his apartment, changed the R on his head to an A, for annihilation obviously, and decided to take revenge on the dude who was responsible for him being fired, a guy named George Finch. And Typeface actually ended up helping Spider-Man fight off another foe called Spider Hybrid. Except George Finch, the guy who got Typeface fired, was not cool with Typeface kicking around. He felt humiliated by the lowly villain and decided to use the bombs that Typeface had crafted to kill Gordon to kill Typeface. For a long time it was believed that Typeface had died in an explosion caused by Finch, but he would later become a vigilante, waging a war with a small-time gang and leaving notes for the police inspired by the web slinger that read, "Compliments from your friendly neighborhood Typeface." Just doesn't quite have the same ring. And at 7, Slide. Slide has to be one of the most ridiculous Spider-Man villains out there. First appearing in the 1986 The Amazing Spider-Man issue 272, Slide is a dude named Jerome Teacher, a chemical engineer who created a non-stick coating that could be applied to literally anything. He was fired from his job, so he decided to use his invention for his own personal gain by robbing banks. He created a bodysuit that would let him slide around on any surface. While that does sound absolutely ridiculous, it did manage to elude Spider-Man briefly, since Peter's webs could not grab hold of him. And at 6, Big Wheel. Okay, so yes, we did put Big Wheel on our list of villains too powerful for the MCU. And yes, we have also included him on this list of the villain's too weak for the MCU. Really, it's because he's a baffling and perplexing character. Big Wheel is a dude named Jackson Wheel, a businessman who embezzled money from the company he worked at. He was afraid of getting caught, so he hired another criminal, a dude who called himself Rocket Racer, to steal the evidence that could potentially incriminate him. But Rocket Racer, being the opportunist he was, took advantage of the situation and blackmailed Wheel with it. Jackson ended up trying to commit suicide because of it, but Rocket Racer prevents him from doing it. Being super humiliated, Wheel heads over to the Tinkerer, who he gets to build him a giant wheel that can climb up buildings, that has Waldo arms and a bunch of guns attached to it. Jackson then calls himself Big Wheel and hunts down Rocket Racer for revenge. Seeing a massive wheel rolling around the city firing off guns catches the attention of our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, but before the web slinger can even intervene, Jackson loses control of his wheel and drops into the Hudson River. Spider-Man has to save him, which he actually doesn't. Everyone just thinks Jackson is dead. Flash forward to 20 years later, turns out Jackson survived, and with his big wheel. He hunts down Spider-Man, informing the hero that he survived and ended up in jail for embezzlement. He was now working through the 12-step program, and one of his steps was to help Spider-Man. Out of pity, Spider-Man lets him follow him around for the day, but Jackson realizes that he is not cut out to be a hero. So instead, he decides he's just gonna use his big wheel and demolition derbies. I guess that's one way of making a living. And at number 5, Kangaroo. There have been 2 villains who have operated under the mantle of Kangaroo in Marvel Comics. The first is the one that lands a spot on this list though. He first debuted in The Amazing Spider-Man issue 81 back in 1970, and his name was Frank Oliver, a fellow who was born in Sydney, Australia, who studied kangaroos, growing obsessed with them. He would eat, sleep, travel, and live amongst the kangaroos, and even developed the ability to leap like them, jumping at heights that rivaled their own. He decided to become a boxer with his newfound abilities, and during one match he severely injured his foe, and ended up facing criminal charges because of it. He fled to the US, where he was detained for not having a passport. Rather than deal with being deported, he fled yet again, embracing a life of crime, calling himself the Kangaroo. He got caught up in some business in which he stole a vial containing a deadly bacteria that Spider-Man had to take care of, while the Kangaroo was just kinda bummed about not stealing something more valuable. Later on, Dr. Jonas Harrow would augment Kangaroo with jets that enhance his leaping abilities, along with popping an implant in his brain to control him. When the Kangaroo fought Spider-Man, Dr. Harrow began to control him, forcing him to steal a radioactive isotope. Spider-Man warned him against doing it, but Kangaroo broke into the lab where it was located, only to be reduced to a pile of ashes upon being exposed to the isotope's radiation. So to sum up Kangaroo, he is an Australian cliche, he has no superpowers, did kinda get superpowers, but they were lame and then he died. And at number 4, Mindworm. Mindworm is a mutant character with an oversized cranium. He was naturally extremely intelligent, but he accidentally killed his mother through his unconscious vampiric psionic feeding. This caused his father to go into emotional shock, which ultimately led to his death. Suicide via running in front of a car. This was incredibly traumatic for Mindworm, aka William Turner, who loved both of his parents dearly. He also had no idea that he was the one responsible for that at that point in time. After his parents' death, he ended up in an orphanage where he was bullied and called Mindworm. When he grew up and got himself an apartment in New York City, he would secretly feed off of the emotions of his neighbors. Not enough to hurt them, but just enough to satiate himself. Spider-Man crossed paths with him when he had to move in with Flash Thompson, who lived nearby Turner. Peter was able to resist Mindworm's feeding to the extent that Mindworm actually attacked him physically because of it. Peter easily knocked him out and Mindworm was arrested. He would later seek vengeance, but learned that Peter had lost his parents too and decided to turn to good. But it gets tragic from here on out. Mindworm would be taken advantage of by criminals wanting to use his abilities and eventually developed severe mental illnesses, to the point where he became homeless. Not wanting to injure others, he would often get beat up on the streets and was eventually killed by a street gang. Yikes. And at number 3, Hypno Hustler. Hypno Hustler is a dude named Antoine who first appeared in the comics in the Spectacular Spider-Man issue 24 in 1978. He was the lead singer of a band called the Mercy Killers. One night when the band was playing at a club called Beyond Forever, Hypno Hustler decided to get greedy and rob the club's safe. Club's manager catches him in the act, and what does our musically hustling friend do? He ends up using his hypnotic equipment on the manager. He likes the effects of it so much that when he and the band play the show, he uses his hypnotizing equipment on the audience as a means to rob them as well. Peter Parker just so happens to be at the club at the time, and ends up changing into his Spider-Man costume to stop them. He removes Hypno Hustler's headphones, causing the villain to be a victim of his own hypnosis, which is pretty darn hilarious. He appeared a few other times after that, briefly, but his claim to fame really was just failing hard. Moving on to number 2, Plant Man. Plant Man is kind of like the dollar store knockoff of DC's Poison Ivy, created in 1963 and debuting in Strange Tales Volume 1 issue 113. He's actually a villain who has crossed paths with many Marvel heavy hitters. Plant Man, aka Samuel Smithers, was a botanist who developed a device that could communicate with plants, something that got him laughed out of the scientific community. During a freak lightning storm, his plant ray gun was transformed into a tool that could control and animate plant life. He then fought against the Human Torch, Iron Man, the Defenders, the list goes on. But he was always sort of a one-off kind of villain. He can create plant simuloids of himself, which are plant clones of sorts that he can use for mercenary endeavors. In Marvel Team Up issue 71, he would finally cross paths with Spider-Man alongside Falcon, with the duo discovering an exotic plant breeding nursery where they took on one of his simuloids. He's defeated when Falcon's winged pal swoops in and grabs his plant ray gun. making him defenseless. Then another time when Spider-Man and Power Man Luke Cage encountered the villain, he threw coconuts at them. So yeah, kinda seems like he might not be the right kind of stuff for the MCU. And finally, in at number 1, Humbug. Described on the cover of his debut issue as the most offbeat Spidey villain yet, Humbug was so bad at being a villain that he later became a superhero and then a member of Heroes for Hire. First hitting the scene in 1986's Web of Spider-Man issue 19, the character, also known as Buck Mitty, was an entomology professor at Empire State University. His funding was cut off, and desperate to fight for the value of his research on the insect world, he ended up designing his Humbug costume in order to steal to provide money for his research. He was wildly unprepared when it came to actually carrying out his robberies though, and Spider-Man foiled his plans, turning his powers back onto him, which landed him in jail. When he got out, he tried it again and fell out of a window. Yeah, Spider-Man had to save him, but Humbug got away by blowing up some cars. Talk about ungrateful. Spider-Man was able to track him down to his lab where he had taken a woman hostage. In order to have Mitty free the hostage, Spider-Man grabbed a jar containing some of Mitty's specimens, a jar of cockroaches, which he then declared to the villain, I quote, "Let the girl go, Humbug, or these roaches die screaming." Humbug would return after that too, with Spider-Man stopping him from stealing a rare scarab amulet from a museum, and Deadpool got involved, dousing Mitty in honey and throwing a jar of South American fire ants at him, which almost killed him, until Mitty communicated with the ants and made them a deal, the ants having already eaten off the outer layer of his skin. All in all, really incompetent villain. Alright, there we have it friends. What other Spider-Man villains do you think should have made our list? Give us a shout in those comments below and let us know your thoughts and feels. If you dug this video, spread the love, hit that like button, and hey, why not subscribe while you're at it? We got a ton of lists just like this one that you'll love. So head on over to our channel or check out the playlist currently flashing on your screen. In the meantime though, thanks for watching friends. I'll catch you on the next video.